So here we have an Odyssey Ebox. It's the complete assembly, the computer assembly that normally sits inside the back of the Odyssey. Here you can see another one partially disassembled. I want to document what happened with this box and what it took to repair it, because it took a little bit longer than expected, because I ran into problems I've never seen before. And so I kind of want to document them here just in case anybody else runs into them. So basically the symptoms were that the computer would power on, but there was no video display, no lights on the peripheral memory board. So the computer wasn't starting up at all. Long story short, I took all of the components out, tested them one by one in a working machine to verify what was not working, and we ended up having a bad motherboard and also a bad video card. This is a bad video card. So once I identified that those were the problems, I replaced it with a new motherboard and a new video card. When I put all of the components back in this box, I had the same symptoms. I didn't want to power up. Well, I knew everything worked in the old box, so I actually took all of the components out of the new box, put them in the old box, and they worked fine. So then I was wondering, why would everything not work in this box, but it worked in the existing box? Well, it took quite a long time to figure this out, because I went back and forth and back and forth. I'd put parts in here, they'd all work, put parts in here, they would not work. So it was quite frustrating, to say the least. Now, I'd actually verified that that motherboard and that video card were indeed bad, because when I had this system up and running, if I put the video card in there in the working system here, I'd get no video output, so I knew the video card was bad. Same with the motherboard. I knew all the other components worked. If I used that motherboard, the motherboard didn't work. So I knew those two parts were definitely bad. So back to the question of why the components worked in the old system versus the new system. I won't tell you how many hours it took me to figure this out, but I finally did figure it out. And here's what happened. This Ebox, as you can see, it's actually pretty shiny and new. It looks like this Ebox was a prototype Ebox, because it's actually a little bit different in construction from a standard Ebox. You can see the standard Ebox here. This whole piece, this unit, was pop riveted into place, as was this unit. If you look in here, they were, it was just spot welded and formed in there. It's a completely different kind of construction. The other thing that I noticed on this one that really didn't seem to be an issue was the hard drive sled. Normally the hard drive has a tab, the hard drive sled has a tab that slides into this bracket here, and then there's one captive screw that holds the entire unit in place. This drive sled has 3 captive screws. 1, 2, 3. And the reason I say it's probably a prototype, this whole thing was a prototype, is underneath this power connector is one of the captive screws, and it's kind of hard to tighten, even with the power connector off. I can show you that. Even with the power connector off, you can see it's kind of blocked. So that's probably why they changed the design. But that was not the problem. That was not why. The drive sled itself was not the reason for the components not working in the system. One thing I will note, this bad motherboard and this new motherboard, you might notice that they're not the same motherboard. That's because the Odyssey used 2 different types of motherboards in their systems. The earlier systems used this motherboard, which is called a Thor motherboard. the new systems, and probably 95% of the machines I've worked on have this newer motherboard, and this is a Tucson motherboard. Functionally they're identical, just different designs. But the one thing major you can notice is this one, the newer one, has a heat sink on this SCR probably here, right next to the power connector. Again, I didn't think that would be an issue, but I noticed that when I had all the components in this system and it would not boot up at all, when I took the system apart to try and troubleshoot it, I noticed that this heatsink was extremely hot. I mean, very hot. You could barely touch it. So that made me think that there was a short happening somewhere in the system. So I began looking at the old Ebox, or actually the newer Eboxes, versus this prototype Ebox. The mounting for the motherboard was basically identical. I mean, all the screws were there. The only thing on this one, it did not have that stud right there. Not that that's an issue, because everything else was in exactly the same place. So I didn't think that that was causing the short, and ultimately it wasn't. I also thought that maybe it was the transformer between the boxes. So I switched transformers. Still had the same problem in this box. So here's what the actual problem was. This power supply and this box, since it's a prototype, the underside of a normal power supply looks like this. It's very flush, and you'll notice that these PEM nuts, there is not one here. And at first I thought, well, maybe there's something wrong with this one. It was just missing. But the newer fan also had this, I can't even think of the name. It had this fan cover basically over that. And that raised up, that protruded from the bottom of the unit. Well, when you turn this whole thing over with the PEM nut sticking out, and you turn it all over and you mount it in the case, it's right over the power supply, or it's right over that heat sink. Well, I found out that all of this was actually touching this heat sink and grounding it out and causing the whole system not to boot up. So what I did on this power supply, since like I said, this is all a different kind of design, I modified. I took the cage off. I also took out the PEM nut because it's not really needed. There's actually 4 other screws that hold the power supply in place, so it's pretty stable. And so I put that. Once I modified that and I put it back in the system, it would still very infrequently not start up. So I figured, well, maybe it was shorting. So I actually measured the clearance that was happening. And again, since this is a slightly different design, the clearance was just a little bit smaller than it should have been on what it is in an existing box. So what I did was I added spacers underneath the captive screws of the power supply unit. So there's spacers here and underneath this screw that actually raise up the back end of the power supply just slightly enough so it clears this heatsink, so it no longer shorts this heatsink out. So that was the solution. So if you ever happen to run across an Ebox that looks like this basically doesn't have the pop rivets. Like I said, it looks, this one is in excellent condition. It looks brand new, actually. But if it's this different construction and you have to swap out an older Thor working motherboard to a Tucson motherboard, just be advised, you need to check the bottom of that fan unit and make sure that you get the clearance so you don't have that shorting problem. So sorry for the long-winded conversation, but the long-winded explanation, but hopefully this saves somebody else some headaches, as much as I went through with this box. But I'm happy to say this box is up and running. It's solid. Works 100% of the time now. Zero issues. So another Odyssey machine is back up and running. So there you have it. Good luck. Let's keep the Odysseys running.